My wife was possessed and I thought we could save her. We prayed, we performed rituals, we did everything to fight back. But the more we tried, the stronger it became. It wasn't just holding on. It was feeding, growing, and waiting. And with every attempt to free her, we only made it worse. Let me take you through the full story of what really happened. My name is James Henry, a small business owner, married to a beautiful girl. I never believed in possession. I thought demons, spirits, and all that supernatural stuff were just stories people told to scare themselves. But now, after everything I've seen, I wish I could go back to that ignorance. My beautiful wife, Claire, was the most rational person I knew. She was a woman of science, always needing logic to explain things. She wasn't religious and wasn't superstitious. If something was broken, she fixed it. If she was sick, she went to a doctor. Simple. So when the strange things started happening, she was the last person who would ever believe it. It started with the nightmares. At first, they were just bad dreams, tossing, turning, the occasional scream in her sleep. I'd wake her up, she'd be sweaty and confused, and then she'd go back to sleep. But then they got worse. One night, I woke up to her sitting up in bed, breathing heavily. "Claire?" I mumbled, still half asleep. She didn't answer. I reached out and touched her arm. It was ice cold. "Are you okay?" I asked, suddenly wide awake. She turned her head toward me, but something was wrong. The way she moved was too slow, too stiff. And then she whispered, "He's watching." A chill ran down my spine. "Who?" I asked. She blinked, then shook her head as if clearing a fog. "What? You just said, 'He's watching.' Who's watching?" Her eyes filled with confusion. "I didn't say that." I stared at her, my heartbeat loud in my ears. "You did, you just said it." She shook her head. "I was dreaming, I guess. Go back to sleep." I wanted to believe her, but things only got worse. The following nights, the nightmares became more violent. She thrashed in her sleep, whispering things in a language I didn't understand. Once I woke up to find her standing in the middle of our bedroom, her back to me, just standing there. When I called her name, she turned around, her eyes dark, her face blank. "Go back to sleep," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. I nearly ran out of the room that night. I begged her to see a doctor, a sleep specialist, a therapist, anyone who could explain this, but she refused. "It's just stress," she kept saying. "I'm fine." She wasn't fine. A week later, I came home early from work and found her in the bathroom, standing in front of the mirror, staring at her own reflection. "Claire?" I called. She didn't move. I stepped closer, looking at her through the mirror. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. "Claire!" I grabbed her arm. She jumped, gasping like she had just surfaced from deep water. She looked at me, her face pale. I think there's something wrong with me," she whispered. That was the first time she admitted it. And that was the night I made the worst mistake of my life. I called Father Michael. I wasn't religious, but I was desperate. I had heard about him from a friend, a priest who had supposedly dealt with unusual situations. When he arrived at our house, Claire refused to come out of the bedroom. "She won't let me in," I told him. Father Michael nodded, gripping his Bible tightly. "That's not her keeping you out, it's something else." A chill ran through me. I knocked on the door. "Claire, please, just talk to him." Silence. Then a voice from inside. Low, guttural. "You shouldn't have brought him here." The hairs on my arms stood up. Father Michael pushed past me and opened the door. What I saw inside made my stomach drop. Claire was standing in the middle of the room, her arms at her sides, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes weren't her eyes anymore. And when she smiled, I knew I had invited something much worse into our home. The possession of Claire. Part 2. Father Michael took one step into the room, holding up his Bible. Claire, or whatever was inside her, never moved. She just stood there, smiling. That horrible, unnatural smile. "Claire," I whispered. Her head twitched to the side and she let out a soft chuckle. "She's not here right now," she said. But it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, layered, as if someone else was speaking through her. I felt my knees go weak. What's wrong with her? Father Michael inhaled sharply. We need to begin, now. He set his Bible down on the nightstand and pulled out a small silver crucifix. The second it left his pocket, Claire let out a piercing scream. Not a normal scream. It was a sound I'd never heard come from a human before. High-pitched, yet guttural, like 1,000 voices screaming at once. Then she moved. Not walked, not ran. Moved. 1 second she was standing near the window. The next, she was in front of Father Michael, her face inches from his. I barely had time to react before she let out another unnatural sound, a deep, rumbling growl that made my stomach turn. Father Michael didn't flinch. In the name of the Lord, I command you. Claire struck him across the face so hard that he fell backward onto the floor. I rushed to help him, but she turned to me, and for the first time I saw it clearly. Her eyes weren't just dark. They were empty. Not black, not red, just nothing, like looking into an endless pit. She took a slow step toward me, her lips curling into something between a smile and a snarl. You shouldn't have done this, Daniel, she whispered. You really shouldn't have done this. I was frozen. My brain screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. And then Father Michael grabbed his Bible and began to pray. The air in the room changed instantly. The temperature dropped, and a powerful force knocked Claire backward. She let out a strangled screech as she slammed into the dresser, her body jerking unnaturally. I grabbed Father Michael's arm. What do we do? How do we stop this? He wiped the blood from his lip. She's fighting back, it's strong. Claire started laughing. Her body twitched violently, her fingers digging into the wooden floor, splintering it. You think he can help you? She hissed. You think prayers will save her? Father Michael ignored her, stepping closer. He began to recite the Lord's Prayer, his voice firm, unshaken. Claire screamed again, arching her back so unnaturally that I thought she would snap in half. Then she stopped. Silence. For a long moment, she didn't move. I took a shaky breath. Did it work? Father Michael didn't answer. He was watching her carefully, then her body twitched. Just once, and then again. And then she started laughing, loud, wild, uncontrollable. She pushed herself up off the floor, wiping blood from her mouth. But when she looked up, she wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She was amused. And that's when she said something that made my blood run cold. Oh, Father, she whispered, tilting her head. You don't even know what you've done, do you? Father Michael tensed. What do you mean? Claire grinned, and when she did, something moved under her skin. Her cheek twitched like something was writhing just beneath the surface. Then she turned to me. You brought him here to help me, she said softly. But all you did was wake them up. The lights flickered, and suddenly I felt it. Not just one presence in the room. There were more, and they had just arrived. The Possession of Claire, Part 3. The air felt thick, suffocating. My skin prickled as if something unseen was brushing against me. Father Michael gripped his crucifix tighter, his face pale but determined. Daniel, he said without looking at me. Whatever happens, don't talk to it. Don't acknowledge. I wanted to ask what he meant by it, but then the lights went out. Total darkness. The only sound was Claire's slow, raspy breathing. And then whispers, dozens of them. Not just coming from Claire, but from everywhere. I spun around trying to find the source, but the voices were layered, overlapping, speaking in hushed tones, in a language I couldn't understand. Some were soft, almost soothing. Others were angry, hissing, snarling. Father Michael began to pray again, his voice steady, unfaltering. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Claire shrieked. The sound blasted through the room like a shockwave, making my ears ring. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head. The walls trembled. Then, a deep, guttural voice, different from Claire's, spoke through the darkness. You think your little prayers can stop us, priest? The voice didn't echo. It didn't come from a single place. It was everywhere, like the walls themselves were speaking. Then the lights flickered back on. And Claire, She wasn't alone. Dark, twisted shapes stood behind her, shadow-like figures, their forms flickering like smoke. No faces, no features, just eyes, hollow, white, watching. My breath caught in my throat. Father Michael took a step forward, raising his crucifix. By the power of God Almighty, I cast you back into the darkness. The figures didn't move. Claire's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. "Oh, Father," she purred. Then something happened that made my blood turn to ice. The shadows laughed, not in one voice, in many. And then they rushed forward. I barely had time to react before an invisible force threw me across the room. My back slammed into the wall so hard I thought I felt something crack. Father Michael wasn't spared either. He was yanked off his feet by nothing, crashing into the bedpost with a sickening thud. I gasped, trying to push myself up. The room was alive. The walls twisted, the floor warped beneath me like a living thing. Claire stepped forward, her movements unnatural, jerky. "You should have left it alone," she whispered. Her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was theirs. Her head tilted, back her mouth opening wider than humanly possible. A thick black smoke began pouring from her lips, and then something crawled out. I don't know what it was, I don't want to know, but I saw limbs, long, thin, wrong. It slithered out of her mouth, dropping to the floor with a wet, sickening sound. Father Michael forced himself up, blood running down his forehead. He lifted his Bible with trembling hands. "Daniel, help me hold her down. Hold her down? Are you insane?" But I didn't argue. I did the only thing I could. I lunged at Claire, wrapping my arms around her. The second I touched her, I regretted it. Her body was ice cold, her skin slick and unnatural, like something wearing human flesh. She let out a sound, not a scream, not a growl, a laugh. The thing that had crawled out of her twitched on the floor. Then it moved toward me. "No! No!" I scrambled back, my grip on Claire loosening. Father Michael shoved his crucifix against Claire's forehead. "In the name of Christ, I banish you," she shrieked again, this time in pain. Her body convulsed violently, her nails digging into my arms hard enough to draw blood. The shadow things around us let out a collective ear-piercing scream. And then they vanished. The room fell silent. Claire's body went limp in my arms. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought we had won. But then I looked at Father Michael. His face was twisted in terror. I turned back to Claire. Her eyes fluttered open. And I realized something horrible. They were still empty. Claire wasn't back. Something else was inside her, now. And whatever it wasn't human. The possession of Claire. Part 4, Claire's body trembled in my arms. Her breathing was shallow, her lips moving, but no sound came out. I wanted to believe she was back, that the nightmare was over. But when she finally opened her eyes, I knew. It wasn't her. They were still empty, not just blank, wrong, like something else was inside, looking through her, trying to pretend. Father Michael staggered to his feet, gripping his crucifix like a lifeline. His voice was hoarse. "Daniel, step back." I hesitated. "But that is not your wife." I froze. The thing inside Claire smiled. "Poor Father Michael," she murmured, her voice soft, almost gentle. "Always so afraid of what you don't understand." Then she turned to me. "And you, Daniel, so full of hope, so desperate to believe she's still in here." I swallowed hard. "She is in there," I whispered. "I know she is." Claire, or whatever had taken her, tilted her head. Her lips curled, but there was no warmth in it. "If you say so." And then she lunged. I barely had time to react before her hands wrapped around my throat. Her grip was inhuman, cold, impossibly strong. My vision blurred as I gasped for air, clawing at her wrists. Father Michael shouted something, prayers, commands, but Claire didn't even flinch. She leaned in close, her lips next to my ear, and then she spoke, not in her voice, not in English. Something, ancient, ugly. The words slithered into my mind like living things, writhing, sinking into my skull. And suddenly, I wasn't in the room anymore. The other place. I was standing in an endless, colorless space. No walls, no floor, just a vast, shifting emptiness. And in front of me was Claire. The real Claire. She was on her knees, her face streaked with tears. "Daniel," she sobbed, "please, please help me." I tried to move toward her, but something held me back. A presence. Something vast and unknowable, lurking just beyond my sight. "You shouldn't have fought us," a voice whispered from the darkness. I turned and I saw it. A figure or something pretending to be one. Tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs too long. Its face, there was no face. Only teeth. Rows and rows of smiling teeth stretching where eyes should be. Grinning, watching. Me had stepped closer. "Give up, Daniel." I looked at Claire. She shook her head violently. "No, don't listen, don't let them." But her voice cut out, like someone had pressed mute. The creature's teeth spread into a wider grin. "She belongs to us." Then the world ripped apart, and I was back. The final stand, I gasped as my body crashed onto the floor, the air rushing back into my lungs. Claire was still on top of me, her hands around my throat, but her grip had weakened. Father Michael stood over us, his Bible open, chanting, louder than ever. The room shook. Claire screamed, her body convulsing, but she didn't let go. I couldn't breathe. My vision darkened at the edges. Then, Father Michael pulled something from his pocket, a small vial of holy water, and he poured it over Claire's head. The reaction was immediate. She howled, her back arching unnaturally. Steam rose from her skin, her body twitching, spasming. For the first time, she looked afraid. The shadows in the room gathered, twisting violently, screeching. Father Michael kept going, and suddenly, Claire let out a horrible, inhuman wail. Her mouth opened wide, too wide, and the thing inside her tore itself free, a black, writhing mass, screeching as it ripped out of her body, twisting and writhing before disappearing into nothingness. The room fell silent. Claire collapsed. I scrambled forward, my hands shaking as I touched her face. Claire, her eyes fluttered open, and this time, they were hers, real, warm, human. Tears welled in her eyes. "Daniel." I let out a shuddering breath. "I'm here, Father." Michael sank to the floor, exhausted, his hands shaking as he murmured a final prayer. It was over, or so I thought. We left that house the next day. Claire was weak, but she was herself again. I didn't question it. I didn't want to. But that night, as I lay in bed beside her, I woke up to a sound, a whisper, coming from her side of the bed. And when I turned to look at her, her eyes were open, staring at me. And in the darkness, I heard her say in a voice that was almost, but not quite her own, "Did you really think it would be that easy?"